The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Optimism may be hard to come by right now, but is the problem even deeper than that? Tonight, has the belief in progress itself stalled? We'll consider that. Then we revisit our conversation with author Joanna Chiu on her new book, China Unbound. It's Monday, January 10th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Western civilization has long held itself up to an ideal about progress, about a future that would always be better than the past. But even beyond this pandemic, some fear that confidence in a world of better tomorrows is fading or worse. Joining us now on that, in Brooklyn, New York, Alana Newhouse. She's the founder and editor of Tablet Magazine. And in Montreal, Quebec, Andrew Potter, associate professor at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy and author most recently of On Decline. And we welcome both of you to our airwaves here in the province of Ontario tonight. Alana, you wrote an essay called Everything is Broken. What is the gist of the brokenness that you see?
Well, my essay focuses mostly on the United States and on the decay of a set of interlocking institutions, both cultural and societal and governmental, that ruled and controlled American life basically since the post-war years. And they functioned very, very well. At least in many ways, they functioned well. So well that people came to imagine that they were going to be here forever and that they were going to function well forever. But as I think we're going to talk about, institutions decay and break apart and need to get replaced all the time. It's just a feature of human civilization. The important thing for me is people knowing that that's what they're looking at right now.
Yeah, we will get to the point in our conversation where we talk about how you two see us getting out of this. But in the meantime, we want to establish your thesis. Andrew, let's put the subtitle of your book up there, which is Stagnation, Nostalgia, and Why Every Year is the Worst One Ever. Okay, what is the gist of the conditions that you feel has led us to our current decline?
In a lot of ways, it's not much different than Alana's argument, in that I'm arguing that there are a set of interlocking institutional and cultural features of our society that are all sort of acting in a self-reinforcing way, and putting us on a trajectory of decline. And like Alana, I think that it started in the 70s, and so what I argue is that there's a combination of technological stagnation, economic stagnation, which has led to a certain political situation, largely having to do with the increasing role of the internet, all of which is being catalyzed into a situation where the types of collective action that give rise to what we call civilization, the resolution of collective action problems that enable us to have economic growth and technological growth and so on, have just come to a halt, right? That we've basically stopped being able to resolve the collective action problems that we face, and as a result, we're heading into a bit of a decline.
And let me do a quick follow-up with you, Andrew. The decline that you describe, is it more along the lines of something, for lack of a better word, apocalyptic, or is this a bunch of little things that are just all combining at the same time?
No, and I think that's important to point out, right? This isn't the apocalypse. It's in a lot of ways an elaboration of an argument that, or not even an argument, just an idea that the writer William Gibson raises in a book he wrote a few years ago called The Peripheral, and the idea is what he calls the jackpot. And what it is it's a whole bunch of things happening all at once. It's climate change, it's pandemics, it's technological decline, it's lack of faith in democracy. All these things give rise to just an increasing amount of friction and discomfort and decay that just sort of adds up year after year, which is why the sort of subtitle of the book is, each year gets worse and worse, but it's not like some big apocalypse happens. It's that after sort of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, you look back and you think, wow, it's been a while since things were on a roll, and you start to think, oh, it's only in looking back that you realize you've been sort of trending downwards. And I think that's the situation we're in right now, where each year we kind of think, oh, things are going to get better. It's just we're in a bit of a lull here right now, and you look back and you realize, no, it's actually much deeper than that. Things have been trending downward for a while.
Alana, I want to set up my next question to you by reading an excerpt from the essay that you wrote for Tablet. It was almost exactly a year to the day ago. And here's the excerpt. Today's revolution has been defined by a set of very specific values: boundarylessness, speed, universal accessibility, an allergy to hierarchy, so much so that the weighting or preferring of some voices or products over others is seen as illegitimate. Seeing one's own words and face reflected back as part of a larger current, a commitment to gratification at the push of a button, equality of access to commodified experiences as the right of every human being on earth, the idea that all choices can and should be made instantaneously, and that the choices made by the majority in a given moment on a given platform represent a larger democratic choice, which is therefore both true and good until the next moment on the next platform. Let's dive into that a little bit. Are you suggesting that our commitment to technological change is not really working out for us very well at all?
No. What I am suggesting is that our idea that we were going to completely revolutionize the way in which every economy, every individual economy, plus the global economy functions, and then there would be a cascade of effects on communication and on the way in which communities and civic societies are organized and function, was going to have no change at all, and was not going to affect the way that we prioritize values, was nuts. And that, in fact, I see this as cyclical. I see that the very, very similar set of chaotic and revolutionary effects happened in the Industrial Revolution. And it's almost like the kind of boa constrictor that swallows a tiger. It takes a long time to metabolize a change like the one that we've gone through. And we have not done that. And in fact, I think we all just imagined that our lives, we just now have email, or we now have Facebook, and that's the change to our life. We can order things quickly on Amazon, and that's the only effect. It's not the only effect. The effect is in every single area of every single person's life, and we need to just look that in the face and then decide then how we want to reorganize our societies given that reality.
Well, I guess I should follow up by asking, if you don't think technology is at the root of so much of what's wrong with us today, why don't you feel that way? Because there's surely no lack of evidence to suggest that so many of our problems are mired in technology performing in a way that we perhaps don't like or certainly didn't anticipate.
I feel that technology is where we see the problems because we have not figured out how we want to use it. Again, the analog of the Industrial Revolution is the best example for me. You can decide that machines are your enemy, which many people did. And that can be the way that you look at things, or you can say these things are instruments. And the question is how we use them. My belief is that yes, the internet has caused enormous problems, but the reason it has caused those problems is because of our absolute falling down on the job of figuring out how best to use them, both individually, at a communal level, at a civic level, at a cultural level, and also governmentally, probably in the biggest way.
Andrew, I suspect every day you and I both read a piece, an op-ed piece somewhere, which says Facebook is the root of all evil, and people are getting stupider because they get all their information from Facebook, which encourages them not to vaccinate themselves and to consider the whole thing a hoax, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you stand on the issue of how well technology has affected our sense of well-being?
So this is interesting. I have to say I really liked Alana's piece. And there's one line in it though where she says, where you say, Alana, I'm not looking to turn back the clock to a time before email and before the internet and so on. And I remember thinking, yeah, I would. And the reason is, I think we're both sort of Gen Xers, right? So we both kind of remember what it was like. And I also remember the first wave of the internet, late 1990s, early 2000s, how great it was and how awful it is now. And so while I wouldn't want to, wind it back to maybe the 1980s, I wouldn't have minded freezing technology around 1994, 1995. One of the things I do, or I used to do when I taught a course on technology and philosophy was I would have everybody read this piece that was written about 1995, 96, that was the Cyber Libertarian Manifesto. You guys might remember this. It was written by like John Perry Barlow and Stuart Brand, a lot of these sort of early techno-libertarians. And it was this manifesto about the internet and how it was going to be this world free of government, free of authoritarianness, free of control. And it would allow this flourishing of democracy, right? Because it would be a pure communicative tool, right? And that obviously manifestly has not happened. And I think we need to understand why that hasn't happened. And it wasn't because we made a bunch of bad decisions or we haven't, substantially metabolized it. I think it's because we didn't fully appreciate the extent to which baked into technology is a set of presumptions about human psychology and the way we can be triggered to behave in certain ways. There's this thing that the behavioral psychologists picked up on a few years ago, right? That we have like two systems, system one, system two. Malcolm Gladwell had that book Blink about our system one, our quick reaction responses to things. And I think what we don't really understand or didn't appreciate was the extent to which technology could be used to keep us in this state of constantly being triggered, like rats in a lab or like people in a casino. And I think that's the problem right now with the internet is it's turned into one big casino where we're kind of running around being triggered relentlessly by buttons and likes and shares and so on. And it's really undermining the capacity we have for rational thought. And I think that's what the original cyber libertarians didn't understand, was just the extent to which the internet would become essentially one big casino that we're all going to sort of wander around in without really rational thought engaged.
Alana,
So
you want to get into that
can I
casino
speak
and
to
try
that?
and roll snake eyes?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that if somebody told me that we could rewind the clock back to a moment when Kurt Cobain was still alive, I would say yes. So just as a correction to Andrew's read of my piece. But here's what I want to say. Tablet is a very strange publication in that it's a niche publication, but has a very, at this point, unique readership. A big part of our readership now is no longer Jewish and just comes to Tablet for the perspective on the world. And a huge cohort of those people are under 25. Our readers who are under 25 are the most suspicious of technology, or rather not suspicious, they're the smartest users of technology. They understand what technology does and doesn't do. They no longer use it the way that, let's say, my generation used it. Certainly a generation older than me uses it, even a generation younger than us uses it. They are very smart about it. And I suppose my challenge is to say that not only did those original crypto libertarians get it wrong, but then the reason why they got it wrong was because they didn't realize that it wasn't going to come true for a long time. There were going to be phases to get there. And the mistake I don't want us to make is to imagine that there's one human condition and one human way to relate to the internet. I don't think there is. And in fact, I think it's changing as we speak. My position is that a couple of generations after me, and certainly moving forward, are actually quite healthy, increasingly healthier there's a cohort of them that are increasingly healthier. Their skepticism is real. They know what the internet does and doesn't do. They know what social media does, what it can do and what it can't do, what it's bad and good at. And the question, the scariest part for me has nothing to do with that, because I think that there are going to be human cohorts that will help us correct our relationship to technology. The scariest part is our governments and their connection, the creation of surveillance states. That's the part that strikes me as poison and both deeply poisonous and also fundamentally changeable. So that's where I focus a lot of where the energy of change, or wanting things to not work, to really be different than how they work right now.
Andrew, I should follow up with you on that, because of course, from your perch at McGill, you spend a lot of time with 20-somethings, and you would, I guess, you would see lots of firsthand evidence about how smart this generation of 20-somethings are, particularly as it relates to technology. Are they as gloomy about their futures as both of your essays would suggest?
That's a good question, but it's a tough one to answer, because we're looking at into our third year of dealing with online teaching of one form or another, and it's hard to disentangle my students' gloominess and unhappiness from the pandemic itself. So it's a very tough question to answer. There's a lot about the new generation that worries me, and things seem to have switched even before the pandemic about how they relate to one another, how they relate to society, how they relate to technology. It's a big question, and yeah, I wouldn't want to speculate about their sort of any of this independent of just this ongoing and very frustrating pandemic.
Understood. Alana, let me try this with you. Do you see a distinction between our lives getting better by one set of metrics? For example, lifespan, relative health, relative prosperity, relative peace in the world, the amount of freedom that we enjoy, the amount of safety that we enjoy nowadays, the entire sum total of knowledge of all time in our hands, the amount of leisure, I guess, pre-pandemic that certainly many people were able to enjoy. Do you see a distinction between all of that and our lives being more fulfilling, however you want to define that?
Yes, but hold on. But before related to that is a larger point, which is I don't see my essay as gloomy. I find it quite hopeful to know that what's broken here are the things that humans made, and humans can remake those things again. In fact, that's the work of society. It's the work of history. So I feel quite optimistic. I understand it's a very hard moment. And I guess I would say that precisely the point I wanted to underscore in the essay is the one that you just made, which is I don't want people to see the meaning or the purpose of their lives as having been in those institutions. It kills me to talk to kids who think that the meaning of their lives is in college. College does not matter. You literally, if I could take Harvard and put it in the middle of the sea and dump it there, I would. It's not important. These institutions don't make us, they shouldn't define us, especially in their decay. So I want to break people from their attachment to seeing these things, these institutions, these entities, all of these credentialing bodies as somehow important. In fact, they're not only important, they're kind of dangerous because they're falling down. And you should divorce yourself from that and try to build new things where you will find not only satisfaction practically, but I think meaning and purpose. So I think that the two things are related, and they're not only related directly, but they're related to my optimism too.
Well said. Let me bring another voice into this conversation, the voice of Margaret Atwood, who was on our program not too long ago. And we talked about this notion of whether progress is inevitable. And here's what she had to say about that. Sheldon, would you run that clip, please?
I don't like the word progressive.
Okay, what should we say?
Why is that? Because it is based on a belief that progress is inevitable, that there's such a thing as the right side of history and that you have to be on it. And neither of those things are true. So history doesn't have sides. And all you have to do is go back and look at it, and one day you're on, quotes, the right side of history, and the next day you're not. It's more like the revolving wheel of fortune. One day you're up, the next day you're down. Public opinion changes. Things that were approved of 50 years ago are now something nobody would ever do. So it's like that, but progress is not inevitable, and it's very dependent on material conditions. So when there's lots to go around, you're more likely to get tolerant public opinion. When there's less to go around, people get scared.
Andrew, do you think she's right to suggest that we temper our hopes as to the inevitability of progress going forward?
Yeah, I really like that clip for a number of reasons. It's interesting. I like that bit at the end where she said that one of the things we neglect is material conditions, and the reason is because as much as I really liked Alana's piece, I think it focuses mostly on the cultural elements of what's going on right now, and I think what I and there's a tendency to sort of assume that culture drives everything, right? Especially in the United States, that was sort of Steve Bannon's motivating argument, right? Was that politics is downstream from culture, and that if you can sort of own or control or sort out the culture, everything sort of follows from there. And what I try and argue in my book is that actually a lot of what's going on in the culture right now is a consequence of material conditions, that is, technological and economic stagnation. And I think Margaret Atwood hit the nail on the head where she said, look, one of the things we know, and this is an argument from Benjamin Friedman, the Harvard economist. I mean, we can put Harvard in the sea, but Benjamin Friedman had something smart to say in his book on the moral consequences of economic growth, where he said, look, we tend to think that economic growth is great because it gives us stuff, right? It makes us comfortable and it makes us healthy and so on. But it also makes us better people. And the reason economic growth makes us better people is because when people think that the world is getting better, when they think they're going to be more comfortable, when they think they're going to be more secure, when they think they're going to be healthier and so on, they become more open-minded, more tolerant of diversity, more tolerant of immigration. They stop looking askance at their neighbors because things aren't zero-sum, right? By contrast, when you have periods of stagnation or even economic retrenchment, people start to look around and they see a zero-sum world, right? And they worried about immigrants, they worry about diversity, they worried about difference. And so I think she's absolutely right that I do think that one of the big problems here that is driving a lot of what's going on right now is the ongoing and quite serious economic stagnation we're into right now.
Alana, there's this great quote of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s in which he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Do you still believe that?
Yeah, I would just encourage people to understand that whatever view of the arc they have, it's much bigger. Things often have a longer trajectory, both longer and shorter trajectories than people assume. There's a quote from a writer that I love, which is that it's not the end of the world, it's just the end of you. And what I really like about it is that that's right. I mean, we really have to understand that what's happening in our own lives may not be does not give us the full view of what's happening more broadly. And so to the extent that we should adjust our work, what we focus on, our own priorities, that's good to know that. It also means that we should adjust our expectations.
All right. Well, you have told us throughout this conversation that you are optimistic about the future and our ability to sort of recreate the institutions which may be letting us down today. How do you see that happening?
I think we have to build new ones. I really do believe that. I believe that we have to really, we have to get into a mindset that everything we know might be irrelevant. That goes for every cultural institution. Do you think that books should have these X publishers? Imagine they don't anymore. Imagine every single book publisher, every single movie studio, every single college and university, every single governmental organization. Imagine that none of it exists tomorrow. What do we build in its place? And to me, that feels very exciting, and it feels hopeful. It also feels like where a lot of the younger people that, at least that I encounter, want to focus. That's where they want to be. They want to be in a world where they can focus on what they can build. As one of them said to me, like, I love my parents very much, but if I have to sit with them and obsess about the New York Times for one more minute, I'm actually going to like kill someone. And like, they're like, I don't care. I don't care about the New York Times. I don't care what's going on college campuses. I don't actually care about any of this. I just want to build something new. And that energy is where I get enormous hope, enormous optimism. It's where I want to live.
Andrew, is that a tough sell for, let's say, university students who are going tens of thousands of dollars into debt on the assumption that all of what they're engaged in right now is relevant and will lead them to a better tomorrow?
You know, that's interesting, because what I think Alana really kind of hit the nail on the head there, where one of the things that's happening that is a lot different from when I was a student is when I was a student in the early 1990s, right? What happened on university campuses stayed on university campuses, and largely what's going on right now is the logic and culture and psychology of being a student has simply taken over the entire society, right? It's taken over newsrooms, it's taken over businesses, it's taken over governments, and so on. Which I hope Alana's right that this is just something that's going to get eventually flushed out. Because and she may be right, and I hope she is, that ultimately we're going through a bit of a cultural madness right now that's going to get flushed out one way or another. But I think I think if that happens, it'll be a good thing and it will help. I don't think it's going to solve our long-term problems. I think the long-term problems are much more deep and much more structural than the culture, although the culture is certainly a huge part of the problem.
But Alana,
What
just
I
to
would
say,
I just
yeah,
want to say
please.
one thing. I don't know which way the arc bends, but my sense of human history is that it bends away from what's very annoying. And what's happening here is very annoying. Like, it's just too frustrating and hard to follow. And it feels impinging on people's ability to actually live full and happy lives. And to me, that's the best indication that it will get flushed out, that eventually it just has to, the human impulse to just want this to get off us is going to prevail.
Well, Andrew, let me give you the last word, and that would be to respond to this. You know, every generation has always assumed, certainly in our lifetimes, and I think you can go back even before that, that the next generation would do better than the previous. We have surveys now which tell us this generation no longer believes that. How much trouble has that put us in?
I think it's a huge amount of trouble. It's funny, that line, right? The first generation do worse than its parents has actually been around for a very long time. I actually did a little research a while ago. It actually appears like in an essay in the Atlantic in like 1980, and then Douglas Copeland made it sort of the rallying cry of Generation X. That call has been wrong every year for every generation until now. And I used to sort of poo-poo the millennials complaining about how badly things were for them. And right now, things are actually pretty bad, especially on the housing front and the job front. So I'm really concerned that, and it's not just economics, not just housing. Recent studies came out showing 18 to 24-year-olds, they're not having sex. right? Like the actual amount they're having sex is lower, and it's not just like the pleasure and the that comes from the relationships and sex and so on. It's like they're not having kids. This is not a healthy trajectory for a society, right? And so I think this is hugely problematic, and I'm really worried about it.
Well, if that is problematic, one thing that isn't, and please convey this to your daughter, Andrew, she did a wonderful job on your fingernails, which we have occasionally caught sight of during the course of this discussion. So please let her know that. Andrew Potter from McGill University, Alana Newhouse, the editor of Tablet. It's really great of both of you to spend so much time with us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you so much.
A decade ago, all the talk about China was of strategic partnerships and a bright trading future. How times have changed. Over the past decade, covering China for the Toronto Star, the South China Morning Post, among others, Joanna Chiu has had a front row seat to the dramatic shift in relations with Canada and many others. She chronicles that in her new book. It's called China Unbound, A New World Disorder. And it brings Joanna Chiu to our virtual studio from Vancouver, British Columbia. It's great to have you back on TVO. Joanna, how you doing?
Thanks so much, Steve, for having me on.
I want to start asking you a question that you pose in the book. Quote, with China on the rise, what kind of global leader would it make if it became the world's most powerful economy? Want to take a kick at that answer?
Yeah, so my family history is so bound up in what has happened with China and Hong Kong in the last decades. We actually went to Canada because of fear over the upcoming takeover of Hong Kong in 1997 after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. So growing up, I was always looking at China from Canada, from this very privileged position I had growing up in Vancouver, and interested in human rights and the development of civil society and the economy in China. So I started reporting in Greater China in 2012, and I wasn't expecting that there would be increasing crackdowns in civil society. Back in 2012, when the current President Xi Jinping came to power, there was actually a lot of optimism about how he would steer China into perhaps a more liberal direction. But instead, the opposite happened. And unfortunately, I had a front row seat as the country sort of veered towards this direction where it was just instilling fear in so many of very moderate critics, including human rights lawyers. There were multiple cases where I was speaking with sources in China, lawyers or activists, and they would suddenly stop responding to me because they had been detained into the system of secret policing. So unfortunately, right now in Beijing, if you're anywhere in that sphere where you could be seen as a critic, where you are perhaps a threat to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy, you could face some pretty serious consequences. And increasingly, I think the world is paying attention because not only Chinese citizens, but foreign nationals, foreign citizens, are getting swept up in this reality of increasing crackdowns under President Xi.
Well, in fact, you say in the book, quote, China is thin-skinned. It threatens anyone who seems to have hurt its pride. And in many ways, you say China is very sensitive. Why would such a powerful force in the world be so thin-skinned in your view?
I try to provide a lot of nuance and historical context in the book because I think without looking at the wider picture, what we see happening can be kind of baffling. Why is China's foreign ministry lashing out at like mildest statements from the UN or countries like Canada or the US? So I go into as concisely and succinctly as possible the last 100 and more years, including a century of humiliation, which that time is known as in China. That encompasses the two opium wars where Britain and the Allied powers basically forced the opening of trade in China, basically forced the sale of opium drugs to Chinese people because the West wanted Chinese goods like silk and tea so badly and was frustrated that the Chinese didn't seem to want any Western goods in return. So basically manufacturing this countrywide addiction to opium. Things like this, they run really deep. It's deeply humiliating. And it's good to remember that China still continues to be a developing country where many people live in poverty. And Beijing is really committed to trying to increase the wealth of the country overall. So also coming from this place where there is anxiety internally about the economy and that people who might fail to climb up, the ladder and get richer might eventually stop being as loyal or supportive to the party. There's a lot of both historical anxiety and also current anxiety about the stability of the domestic economy and the support CCP gets from its own citizens.
Let me follow up on that because, we in the West tend to think when we put ourselves in the world, we tend to look back at least 5 or 10 minutes at our history before we consider our place in the world today. In other words, we don't look back much at all. How important is it for us to remember that for the Chinese government, to be sure, but also a significant chunk of the Chinese population, these century-old humiliations are important today. And we need to take that into account when we think about relations with this country. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think it just provides context because a lot of people are worried right now about Beijing's rise and influence in the world. But I think people also overestimate the type of hostility that is involved. When you look at Beijing's actual actions, they are still showing up to international summits. They're still taking calls from world leaders. They're not seeming to be interested in isolating themselves. In fact, I don't think they have a choice because with globalization, China joined the World Trade Organization, its economy is so integrated and central to the world. So what I question is whether Western governments and societies are using these avenues of engagement well, whether it comes from a place where there is informed understanding of China's domestic situation and its foreign policy goals and what it's doing around the world in trying to cross over borders and surveil, monitor, and stifle criticism overseas. In the research for my book, where I focus on Western countries and I traveled around Europe, Australia, the US, Canada, the main theme and feedback I got from people is that they've been warning about some of Beijing's international influence efforts for decades. But it's only been recently where what happened in Canada with the two Michaels being taken brazenly as hostages, where it seemed more of the mainstream public and Western society started being concerned and didn't just look at China as a potential huge economic market, but that there are complex political realities as well, and definitely a chip on shoulders of Chinese leaders where they are seeming to overreact to criticism and to pressure from the West.
Obviously, we are going to talk about the two Michaels in a few moments' time, but while you have raised the issue of China basically trying to make friends all over the world as it relates to business with its New Silk Road Initiative, et cetera, there's a comment here. A prominent Greek businessman that you spoke to called China, quote, a modern-day colonizer. And he said the Chinese found out that by financing the infrastructure of the countries, you conquer them. Do you think that's a fair knock?
Well, I actually interrogate those assumptions. And what was interesting was that in Greece, this prominent businessman, he's actually head of the Chamber of Commerce there, is that he thought China was a colonizer, but he didn't think that was a bad thing. To him, money was power, and China having money meant that it was right to have more respect and control in the places in the countries where it was providing loans, including, of course, Greece. So that kind of complicates things because he welcomed Chinese state investment in Athens port, taking over the port and the trade flows there. It was, on a large part, actually quite welcome on the ground among Greeks. And we don't see that kind of narrative, perhaps that's more prominent in the US and in Australia, where investments from China are, things to be suspicious of.
Well, here's the voice of China answering back. This is from a state-run organ called Global Times. And here's the comment. Canada, the UK, and Australia, 3 members of the Five Eyes Alliance, have recently taken action to put pressure on China. They have formed a US-centered, racist, and mafia-styled community, willfully and arrogantly provoking China and trying to consolidate their hegemony as all gangsters do. They are becoming a racist axis aimed at stifling the development rights of 1.4 billion Chinese. The formation of 4 states, except the UK, is the result of British colonization. Those countries share the Anglo-Saxon civilization. With a common language, a common historical background, and a coordinated attack target, such an axis is destined to erode international relations and allow hooliganism to rise to the diplomatic stage. Global diplomacy in the 21st century must not be hijacked by a fake international community with an axis of white supremacy. I hear you laughing, but that's axis of white supremacy. What do you make of that kind of language?
Well, just to provide a disclaimer, like the Global Times is perhaps the most hawkish and belligerent state-affiliated tabloid in China. Perhaps it's not entirely a direct mouthpiece from Beijing officials, but definitely it reflects perhaps a portion of the Chinese leadership, if not generally. I did, living in Beijing, speak with much more thoughtful people than what you would assume from the editorials that the Global Times regularly produces, or even the statements that the official foreign ministry regularly puts out. But what's interesting in that statement is it reflects some of the main talking points that the CCP uses to try to discredit international criticism. Canada, and along with other states, have been trying to work more on a multilateral level to put pressure on Beijing against what is happening, like the internment of around 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps in Xinjiang. Countries feel that speaking as a group, they have a stronger voice than alone, which I think makes a lot of sense. But Beijing is trying to shape this and make it seem like a racist attack, that any criticism of China is racist. And they're really, really deliberately trying to encourage conflation of the Chinese people, the 1.4 billion Chinese people, citizens, and the Chinese state. What is concerning to me is that while this seems ridiculous when you see it, flash across the screen, many people in the West do conflate Chinese people and the Chinese state. Former President Donald Trump, he has said repeatedly that he thinks all international students from China are spies, that they should be treated as spies. And scientists in the US have been persecuted and, found that there was no basis to these persecutions. And a lot of experts on China worry that this Red Scare, this conflation of the CCP and the Chinese people, is playing into what Beijing most wants to see. It wants to paralyze more productive and nuanced dialogue in the West by making it seem as if this is a racist attack that is just going to stoke xenophobia. Unfortunately, in the West, we haven't been very nuanced in showing that that's not what they're saying. We're not conflating the people of the states. And in my reporting, I draw on decades of warnings and testimonials from people of Chinese descent in countries like Canada, where they've been trying to warn that Beijing has been trying to do this, trying to support these narratives. But time and again, they have been ignored. They've been ignored. Now they continue to feel very just not supported. Myself, when I have reported on human rights in Xinjiang and received hundreds of threatening messages, going to the police, they tell me there's nothing they could do. Talking to the Bill Blair's office and Ministry of Public Safety. Meanwhile, they say Canadians who feel concerned about threats from foreign sources should go to the police. But when people go to the police say there's nothing they can do. So it's kind of a circular response people get from authorities that make them feel really unsupported, and that it's playing into this myth that people of Chinese descent are this homogenous group that all support what Beijing is doing, which isn't true.
You just used the word nuance there in that answer, and I think, if memory serves, about 3/4 of the way through the book, you talk about the fact that we're not living in times where we do nuance very well, and these are times in which maybe being able to act on a global stage with a little more nuance would be very helpful. What do we do about that?
So the cabinet in the U.S., Canada just had a reshuffling of the cabinet. But in general, people tell me that they worry there's not enough expertise on China advising governments. The Liberal Party in Canada, and definitely, many ruling parties in Canada, most of their advisors in China have been people in the business world, where, of course, they have really valuable lived experiences doing business in China, but they also have vested interests, and they also have interests in making sure that relations are as friendly as possible so it doesn't affect the business relationship. So people spoke to me of this assumption that Western countries like Canada could approach China with kind of dual track diplomacy. On the one hand, they could bring up human rights and bring up civil rights. And on the other hand, they can just aggressively expand economic and trade ties as much as possible, and those tracks will not cross. But that kind of assumption came crashing down in recent years when Beijing has done more acts of economic coercion or retaliation. So after Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou at the request of U.S. authorities, Beijing stopped importing Canadian canola and pork products for quite some time, as very clearly a way to put pressure on Canada to release Meng. And so that was done in conjunction with taking the two Michaels as hostages. And now, because they were released the same day that Meng was, it's very clear that they were in fact political pawns. So a lot of Western countries, the lesson they should take from that is it's not possible to have this kind of arrogant view where the West can only benefit from China's rise without thinking about political dimensions or that there could be repercussions on its people.
Well, since you've raised the two Michaels, let's follow up on it here. You're a friend of Michael Kovrig's, are you not?
Yes, I knew him personally in Beijing, and many journalists and diplomats and people who lived there at the time knew him. He was very social and friendly to everyone.
Have you been in touch with him since he's returned home?
I've been in touch with his family, but he is trying to take some time for himself and to obviously adjust back to what must be a very strange reality coming back to Canada as the global pandemic is continuing.
That sounds like a very sensible thing for him to do. Given how this situation transpired over the 3 years, more than 3 years that it did, what do you think is the single most important thing we learned about dealing with China as a result of the two Michaels situation?
What I get struck by in years of reporting on human rights is that individual lives and liberties isn't of great concern to China's top leaders. They've been incarcerating people for all sorts of reasons, including teenage bloggers who spread rumors about Chinese leaders that authorities did not like, including lawyers, like I mentioned, whose only crime was doing their jobs, basically taking cases of farmers who lost their land or Christian pastors who were stopped from preaching. So not only the two Michaels, but so many people have lost their freedom and basic human rights, I would say, from basically just whims of Chinese authorities who have been trying to basically crack down on all levels of civil society. Even the CCP says it supports women's rights, but a few years ago it arrested 5 feminists, and for the reason that they were attempting or planning to give out stickers on public transit to raise awareness about sexual harassment on buses and trains. So something like that is seen as a potential threat to Beijing. So let alone a major crisis, according to Chinese perspective, of its basically royalty, Meng Wanzhou, being taken, which was very humiliating of course, they didn't have qualms about trying to take some relatively high-profile Canadians. They're not high-profile in the sense that they were famous, but I think it seemed like there was a deliberate intention to arrest people that, frankly, white people around the world would relate to. And people have said as much to me that they knew that there were political prisoners for decades, including many in the past of Asian descent. But suddenly there were two men who basically looked like them, who looked like their friends, sitting in jail for almost 3 years as essentially political pawns. That really upset a lot of people around the world.
Mm-hmm. You know, I must confess that as I was reading the book, and as you were giving more and more and more examples of either Chinese nationals who are living here, who are being harassed for whatever reason, and numerous examples that you've given from around the world, I kept thinking, is she not worried about her own safety in writing this book? I mean, there's no question the Chinese government's not going to be in love with this book if they read it. Do you worry for yourself?
I think anyone who works on these issues worries for themselves and their families. And it's basically kind of a dark backdrop of all of us who work on China issues. And as a journalist, I really should be in a position where I shouldn't worry, because everything I write, I try to make it as factual as possible. And, you know, this whole interview in my book, it is as critical of the West for being ignorant or getting China wrong or, you know, acting out of self-interest as it is critical of Beijing.
Joanna, that's true, but I'm not sure the Chinese regime would necessarily note the nuance of that comment.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So a lot of China's actions have been really, to describe it, irrational. It doesn't make sense. Like, I try to provide the nuance and context to try to explain Beijing's actions, but overall, this great sensitivity, it means often China's diplomats and authorities are lashing out. They're not really seeming to make actions from a calm perspective. And that's very concerning, not just for people like me, individuals, but for, you know, global peace in general, when it's in a state of such instability. So it's tough because a lot of journalists have fled China. I worry about the foreign correspondents who are there on the ground still. Some, like a BBC correspondent, received death threats, and that's why he had to move his family out. 2 Australian correspondents got a tip that they were about to be detained in some sort of national security case, so they had to seek refuge at the Australian embassy in Shanghai and Beijing. So it's becoming really dramatic, and journalists and researchers who just want to report on the ground there, or even from overseas like I do, end up, you know, in these situations where they and their families are in danger. Journalists have been separated from their children, being questioned and interrogated. So it is a very tough situation. I'm not planning to go back to China or try to go back to China anytime soon. And definitely it's tough, because if you read the book, you can see how I clearly actually love my time in China and society and the people there. I really try to portray the nuanced perspectives of Chinese people, and including the interviews I was able to get from Chinese officials on background. They didn't want to give me their names, but they're also trying to raise alarm bells about how repressive things have become, where there's basically no room in the political system for there to be opposing voices, for there to be more of a dialogue. President Xi has really consolidated his power. And when I first arrived to my last time reporting on the political Congress in March 2018, people used to speak with me, but the last year, people pretended they all had the flu and lost their voice, literally, and weren't able to speak with journalists anymore.
Can you tell us, just finally, whether you think the West and China are inexorably onto a Cold War course now?
I think if it's up to certain forces in the US. I spoke with people in the military in the US who worry that there is this direction. There's a lot of kind of war drum beating where some influential people feel that there's some sort of ideological existential crisis that America is facing, where China is really trying to take over and diminish American power in the world as leading superpower. I hope that the more moderate voices in the US will ultimately prevail and like put some checks and balances. And there's also responsibility for middle powers like Canada to also be like a sober, reasoned, nuanced voice in these conversations. I think a lot of people in Canada have kind of had the assumption that they're not powerful enough to make a change, so better sit back and let Washington steer the show. But that is not the case because Beijing basically dismisses anything that American officials say now. There's limited negotiation and dialogue opportunities between the US and China, whereas other countries might have the ear of influential Chinese officials more so. And if they are getting good information and advice from China experts, they might be able to use those opportunities better to kind of reduce the real possibility of some sort of conflict in the future, not just this war of words that we're seeing and trade war, but an actual military conflict. I think we all have a role to play in trying to keep these avenues of discussion and dialogue open and to express that and to push the view that promoting universal human rights isn't something that the Chinese people don't want.
Well, that word keeps coming up, nuanced. And I can say that this has been an absolutely fascinating, nuanced look at China Unbound, a new world disorder. Joanna Chiu, it's been great having you on the program. And you can tell your cat that he or she obviously wants a cameo.
Thank you. Yes, Mimi is excited about her, her star showing here. Thank you for having us.
Not at all. Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, January 10th, 2022. Tomorrow we'll debate whether the United States is at risk of engaging in a civil war, as author Stephen Marsh believes it is in his latest book. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.